everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, John. I'm loving this month of May. I love this month.
We have been just spoiled by weather, I think. This has been so great. I got to ask you, though, with weather like this, you always say your rule of thumb is to not plant until Mother's Day. Here we are, the Thursday before Mother's Day. Have you planted anything yet? Because it's been so nice.
Yes, actually, I got some bare root roses.
Okay.
And of course, bare root means they aren't in leaf yet, and so they wouldn't be damaged by frost. And so I did plant 3 bare root roses. I have not planted anything that would be frost sensitive.
Okay.
Because my favorite 10-day period, I start thinking about things around Mother's Day, but my favorite 10-day period for planting is May 15th to the 25th.
Okay.
Because around May 15th, I can kind of see what the weather patterns look like they're doing, see if they're kind of anticipating a chilly, frosty night. And so I like that 10-day period. But, if I had gotten around to it, I could be planting out in the vegetable garden peas and carrots and radishes and potatoes, things like that. They're going to take a while to come up anyway, and that don't mind some chilly soil. But no, I have not planted anything out that I would have to cover if we get chilly weather. How about you?
No, not planting anything. We're in the process of building some raised beds, so we're just kind of getting the infrastructure in.
Oh, sure.
So that'll
good time to do that.
Yeah, it is. It is a good time to do that, and yeah, it's nice to work outside. It's just such.
Oh, we've had some wonderful days.
It's so great to be outside. The bugs aren't so bad yet. I've seen a couple. But the sun is great. It's so nice to be outside.
Well, this is really the month that everything comes alive. Winter ends, but when you actually see the trees leafing out, the flowering crab apples are about on the verge. Plums are blooming.
Yep.
And the ornamental pear trees, as I'm driving around, the beautiful white flowers. And so this is really the month that things come back out of winter, isn't it? And of course, the lawns. Have you mowed your lawn?
Not yet. I probably could.
I'm on my 3rd mowing already.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, which I love. I love mowing lawn. That smell is great. So, yeah, I'm really loving this month. And it's going to be fun to talk about planting because, man, a lot of planting gets done during this month of May.
Yeah, it's kind of almost like opening. This is almost like opening day for baseball, pretty much.
It is.
That this is the time of year when people will be going in and getting into planting. But before we dig into the dirt, we'll dig into a question you had from a listener.
Yes. Don writes in and asks, is it best to remove the old wood chips around shrubs and then put down new wood chips, or just put the new wood chips over the top of the old? He says, other than looking faded, nothing seems to be wrong with the old chips. There's no bugs, no weeds, and no thin spots. So thanks for your question, Don. And yeah, that is a good question. So when you're using wood chips or shredded mulch, do you need to take the old off and put new on, or just put the new right over? And the answer is just put the new right over the old, because the old, as it comes in contact with soil, will just break down into good organic material, and that's wonderful. It'll help improve the soil. So no need to rake off the old, just put the new right over the top.
And you use mulch, right?
Yeah, I like the shredded wood mulch. I get it from one of the tree companies that take down trees and then they grind it up into nice mulch. And the shredded mulch kind of nests together very well, and so it doesn't blow off. Sometimes wood chips can kind of float around, blow around a little bit. But the shredded wood mulch lays and nests together quite well. And so I found that to be a very good mulch rather than kind of the typical wood chips. And just last week, I got a whole truckload, 15 yards of wood chips. So the driveway is not entirely accessible because there's a whole truckload of chips sitting in there just waiting for me and my wheelbarrow.
That'll be a great time. A great time.
Yes.
Great thing to do
I'll get
outside.
my steps in.
Yes, exactly. Well, let's talk about planting, and let's talk about how we go about planting the different things. But one of the first things that we should talk about is your soil, your dirt.
Right, because that's what everything gets planted in, isn't it, is soil.
So we're building raised garden beds. What kind of a soil mix should we put in there? Because do we put in a potting mix? Do we put in just regular dirt? What would you say?
Yeah, and in most cases, if we're talking about an in-ground flower bed, a perennial bed, or an in-ground vegetable bed, most of our soils aren't quite the way we'd like them. And when I say not quite, they're either usually too heavy or too light and sandy. Okay, if you're lucky to have a wonderful loamy soil, then you really don't need to do much with it. But for example, our heavy clay soil is just so compacted. And so the addition of organic matter is wonderful. Or if you're like in lakes country where it's very sandy, organic matter also will help give a moisture holding component to that. So if we're dealing with an in-ground bed or situation, garden, incorporating maybe 2 to 3 inches of organic matter over the top and then working that in. Peat moss, bagged manure products, your own compost, all of those are wonderful to add in. So if we're talking about a raised garden, such as you're raised, okay, what do we use? What is the best mix for that? Well, there are bagged raised garden mixes that you can buy at garden centers and hardware stores and national chains, and they're excellent. The only complaint with those is that sometimes they dry out too quickly.
Okay.
They're maybe a little too light. And so we don't want to be watering things every day. So a good recommendation is to use maybe about half of a good raised bed mix, bagged mix, and then add about half of just topsoil. You can, if you don't have access to where you can dig up some topsoil, they sell bags of topsoil and they aren't too expensive. And so once you get a nice blend in a raised bed like that, or a big raised container, then it'll last for many years. You don't need to take out and replace each year. And much the same in pots and planters and containers too. If you start with a high quality mix, then that will last for years. You don't need to replace it. Sometimes what Mary and I enjoy doing is maybe take out a fourth out of our planters, our pots and things. Maybe take a fourth out, add a fourth of new in. And now, unlike your big raised vegetable planters, in pots and containers where you're growing flowers and things, just a good quality mix. You don't need to add in topsoil, but just a good quality mix. Either one, either one of the national brands or one that the garden centers recommend. That drains well yet holds the right amount of moisture. So getting that right mix in a planter is quite important. For example, if you took soil from an in-ground vegetable bed and put that in a pot, in a pot or container, it just packs too heavily. And so that's why these mixes were invented, to allow things to grow better in a pot or container.
Should you look for a different mix for different situations? Like if you're doing a pot, do you want a certain kind of mix versus if you're doing a hanging basket where the bottom may be a little bit more exposed, it would have more air circulating around it? Would it dry out quicker?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Consider.
Some of these bagged mixes now are labeled moisture control mixes. Have you noticed that? One of the main national brands labeled moisture control mixes, and they indicate right on the label it prevents overwatering and prevents underwatering. And they have components in. One of those components of many of those mixes is the coconut coir, COIR. I never know how to pronounce that. Coconut coir, which is a nice organic material, and it allows good drainage, but yet it doesn't overly dry out. One disadvantage of peat moss, that's a wonderful product too in mixes, but one disadvantage is when that dries out, it tends to be difficult to re-wet, whereas the coconut coir in that mix helps it to re-wet and just have a really good moisture. So for hanging baskets and other containers that might dry out kind of rapidly, that moisture control mix, I think, is a good idea. We've had good success with it.
Excellent. So what should we use? Let's talk about something like, should we just dive into how to plant?
Yeah, let's do that. Oh, by the way, before we move on, I was going to ask you, have you heard what the dirt said to the earthquake?
No.
This is groundbreaking. Well, we were talking dirt. I couldn't resist my dirt joke.
That's the dirtiest joke we will ever tell on this show.
You got it, John.
So let's talk about kind of like we're going to talk about this a lot in the show, like how to plant things, how to plant their plants, how to plant different kinds of plants. But let's start with our annuals.
And so it's interesting. There are all these kind of neat little experiences that a person do. Sometimes they're seemingly small things that can make or break success with plants, and one of those is planting. And I love old experienced gardeners because they've learned all these just little simple tweaks that you do to make things. And planting is one of those things, very important. So, for example, with annual plants, when we buy things, maybe it's wave petunias, maybe it's marigolds, other types of things for flower beds or containers. One of the things that I was taught that I just loved, and that is when you get those home, or if you've grown them yourself under lights, and typically they're blooming, the best thing to do is take your scissors and cut off all the flowers.
It seems harsh.
That seems very harsh. But, my mom taught me that because that's what experienced gardeners used to do. And I thought it was awfully harsh to get rid of that. But what I observed and why she did that was removing the blossom and kind of pinching the plants back, removing kind of the central growing point, allowed those plants to become bushier and healthier. They didn't send all their energy into just a couple of weak blossoms, spindly little blossoms. But instead, removing that allowed that plant to adjust to their new home, to root in, and then they just flourished more. And so I do that just routinely. When I get the plants home, cut off all the flowers and plant them. The other thing that is so neat with pinching out the centers, it's called. For example, a petunia, if you kind of picture that, whether it's a standard petunia or a wave-type petunia, there are kind of these growing points, kind of called centers, these growing points. And when you pinch out the center, the growing point, where you pinched it off, there will be two sprouts that arise from that. For example, a zinnia. A zinnia plant arises kind of one stalk. Okay, when you pinch out the center of that, within a matter of time, two sprout from that. So immediately by pinching those back, you have doubled the plant size that it's going to be and doubled the amount of bloom. And so it just works so well. So close your eyes and cut the plants back like that.
Question with that. So after you plant it, when you pinch it back the first time, do you do another pinch since it's still so young and getting settled?
Usually one.
Just the one
once is enough.
Okay.
Of course, an exception is if you've got a graduation open house coming up, you need your planter to be full and blooming. And of course, one of the objects of any graduation open house is to make people think you live like that all year long.
Right, exactly. And a clean garage.
Yes. And so, yes, leave the flowers bloom well, but maybe trim them back then after the graduation open house is done. And so a couple other guidelines for planting annual flowers, whether it's in-ground flower bed or in a container, plant them at about the same depth that they are in the little pack or pod. Don't go too much deeper than that or the stems could rot, but don't have the little pack of soil, don't have that standing up out of the soil either, otherwise that dries out too. And of course, after kind of burying the little root ball, kind of press it a little bit. I mean, don't squeeze the soil down, which compresses all the air out, but just kind of gently firm the plant in. Another question too is, okay, when you take a little annual out of its little pack or pot, and you find lots of roots all wound around, should you untangle those a little or should you just leave them undisturbed? And if the little pack isn't totally filled with roots, then I usually plant them undisturbed. But if it looks like it's all tightly wound around, then usually with my fingers, I gently tease apart the roots a little bit. Now, on all the things that we're going to talk about planting, roots do not like to be exposed to air. They can die within a few seconds. So, for example, when I'll take a petunia out of its little pack, and if the roots are all tightly wound around, I kind of want to tease them apart so they might go out into the soil better. And so I'll, with my fingers, just quickly tease them apart, but we don't want to expose them to air too long. So tease the roots apart just a little bit, plant them down in, firm it down, and before you've planted too many things, then water it. The watering is important to firm everything in well also. And if you're doing a flower bed with annual flowers, it helps to leave a little depression around each of the flowers, so that'll hold a little bit of water as well. And anything else that you thought about for annuals, like in containers? Any other things you thought about for planting, John?
Well, I think, we talk about this a lot, it's like if you're planting, especially in a container, to keep in mind what they will be as far as like how they will grow. Will they grow up or will they trail? If they trail, you probably want them on a side facing you. Also, how many you should have in there.
Boy, you got it, because they look so small when they're small.
Yes.
And it's easy to make the mistake of putting too many plants in a container. But if you plant them too close, you might think, well, gosh, it'd be kind of nice to have it full. But if you plant too many things in a container, they'll outcompete each other. And so the final result won't be as extravagant. Things will just kind of, each of them will overshadow the other, and the end result just won't be what we wanted to accomplish.
It won't be the case of only the strong survive. It'll just be that none of them really rise to their. But yeah, so that you take into consideration that with when you're planting big planters. When you're talking about just thinking about how kind of delicate those little cell packs are, and if you're planting those. When you're watering them the first couple times, a lot of times when we water, sometimes if we're using a watering can. You can't necessarily get too close to the dirt. Do you really want to be careful that first couple waters just to get the dirt and not get the flowers up on top or the leaves on top?
Yeah,
that you don't want to weigh them down.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. To concentrate the water on the soil. Because we want to eliminate air pockets and things and to firm that soil around the roots so that the roots can go out. The other thing, you brought up a good point too, John, is, okay, when you're removing a plant from a pack or a pot, how do you get that out? I've made the mistake of grabbing onto the plant and pulling upward, and I have separated the plant from its root system. And of course, that's not good. There went that plant. And so, but it works well, like with a little 4-pack, to squeeze the bottom of that a little bit, kind of while you're gently grasping the plant, squeeze the bottom, maybe turn it on its side a little bit, and the plant will usually come out. The other thing that I like to do is water the cell pack right before I'm going to take plants out of it. Okay. Because if that soil is moist, it will come out, the plant will come out of the cell pack easier.
Okay.
And so, but I found that just by gently squeezing on the bottom of that cell, the plant will come out. And of course, for potted, kind of larger potted annuals, if you maybe turn them on the side, knock with the palm of your hand, knock on the bottom of that pot, and gently lifting on the plant, then they'll usually come out too. If they're real solid, sometimes I have to run a knife around the inner perimeter too. But oh gosh, I felt bad when I've pulled the plant right off of its roots. That's especially if you've paid dearly for a plant.
Well, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, let's talk about how to plant our vegetables.
Get 6 months of local news for just $2. You get unlimited access to the news and information you need to stay connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to get 6 months of local news for just $2.
All right, so we're back and we're talking about how to plant the plants that we've bought that we've been waiting to get into the garden. We've been waiting to get into the ground. We're coming up on that time. How do we plant? We talked about how to plant our annual flowers. What about our vegetables? The other big one.
Sure. Vegetables, of course, there's two different types of things that get planted. Some things get planted from transplants. Other things get direct seeded into the ground. Carrots, radishes, spinach and all that, lettuce just gets mostly. You can buy plants like of lettuce, but generally those things just get direct seeded into the ground. And of course, the seed pack will tell how deeply to plant those. But it's interesting, like if they indicate carrots a 1/4 inch, it's hard to take out a ruler and measure a 1/4 inch. So what a person does is just with your hoe, dig a very shallow trench, just barely scraping the surface, then plant your seed, and then with either a rake or hoe, just pull a little bit, barely covering that seed. And then you hit about the 1/4 inch. It's pretty hard to gauge that with a ruler. But other large seeds, beans, peas, corn, good sized seed, they're generally 1 inch. On the human hand, the distance from the tip of your finger to the first joint is about 1 inch. So when I'm planting peas and beans and that, I use my finger as kind of a guideline for how deep I've taken that trench, and then pull the soil back over. So you've got your direct seeded type vegetables. Other vegetables, because they take a long season if you were to direct seed them, such as cabbage and cauliflower, broccoli, and tomatoes, although Burpees claims that they have a tomato seed you can just plant direct in. And so we'll wait to see on that one. But generally, those type of plants, peppers, tomatoes, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, you transplant plants out into the garden. And so you get much earlier crop than if you were to put a seed in of a cabbage. So the planting depth on those should all be at about the same depth as the plant currently is. Maybe just a slightly lower. Peppers don't like to be planted much deeper than they're currently growing. Cabbage and cauliflower plants, so that they don't whip in the wind quite as much, you can tuck those maybe slightly deeper down in. And some types of vegetables you can either direct seed into the ground, or you can use transplants, such as cucumbers, melons, squash, pumpkin. You can just direct seed them, or get some plants from the garden centers, or start your own too. So those can be kind of an either or. Plants.
Tomatoes are pretty forgiving as far as if you're buying a plant from a garden center, you can bury that deeper than the ground
let's
level.
talk about tomatoes a little bit. Tomatoes are unique in that they have the ability to send out roots all along the buried stem. So if a person's got a nice sized tomato plant, the best way to plant those is to remove the lower set of leaves, anything that would be below ground level, below soil level, remove those lowest leaves, and then plant them deeply down in, because they will root from all along that stem. So you'll get a better root system. At the end of the season, when I'm cleaning up the garden, I've pulled or dug out some of those, and it's neat to see those roots that came along from that stem. Now, if you can't dig deep enough to get it buried, so that just the top whirl of leaves, tomato leaves, are up above soil, if you can't dig deep enough, you can lay them in a trench. Dig kind of a horizontal trench and lay the tomato plant in there, and gradually have the upper part bending up out of the ground.
So you can't
doing
it kind of as an angle, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a better way to describe it. Planting it at an angle.
Okay.
And remember what side of the plant you laid that. The stem. Okay, the reason I indicate that is if you're hoeing around them to get some weeds, sometimes the root is a little distance from the part that's coming up out of the ground because you've buried that stem. And I've caught plants with the hoe. If you can picture, because the root system and stem was a little ways from the part that's poking up out of the ground.
Yeah.
And so just remember which end not to pull up on a hoe. You see, I'm a good candidate because I've made all the mistakes there are on most of these things. And yes, but tomatoes, in addition to getting all nice roots from along that buried stem, also they won't whip in the wind as much. Without quite so much sticking up above ground, they won't be as wind whippy. And so tomatoes are kind of unique in that. Other vegetables like a pepper plant, you wouldn't want to bury them that deep because they resent deeper planting like that.
I think one thing with tomatoes too is that what we've noticed, and we're planning for our garden, our raised beds for our vegetables, is that we want to have tomatoes kind of in the back a little bit so that they don't block out, because they will get so tall.
Great idea.
You want them as, not so far back that they get less light, but just that you don't want them blocking the sun.
Out your lettuce.
Yeah, exactly, for more ground cover things.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Well, shall we talk about perennials next?
Yeah, let's.
All right. And of course, perennial flowers. Oh, man. I can't get enough perennial flowers, so I'm going to plant lots more. And now this is another case when we go to the garden center and buy that potted perennial, color cells. So a blossom on that perennial plant helps you determine what the color is and what the flower shape and all that. But the best thing to do when you get that perennial home is cut that flower off, because, of course, perennials especially, where we want them to develop a good, sturdy plant system to come back year after year, that first year, if we can put all the energy into that root system and a developing crown, it'll be better. And, of course, that little wimpy blossom that's there, well, even if it's a nice blossom, that's still taking energy from that plant. And so, again, close your eyes and cut off that blossom and let the perennial really develop. Because, for example, a peony, if it tries to send up 1 or 2 weak little blossoms, that's really a drain on that plant. So let's be in it for the long haul. And, it's funny, some of these things, they seem tragic, but it gets easier the more you do them.
Yeah.
You're thinking about how good that is for that plant. And so now most perennials should be planted at about the same depth as they are in the pot. Also, perennials love organic matter. So it's a good time to incorporate some organic matter like peat moss, some of the other organic type products, bagged manure, down into the planting hole. Perennials don't develop a widespread root system, not like a tree or a shrub. They have a root system that will only go outward, maybe 18 inches or so, maybe 2 feet on some of the larger ones. But we can amend that soil nicely with organic matter. And so almost any plant tag on a perennial will say loves organic matter, loves rich soil. So add plenty of good stuff in and around and in the backfill material. Planting depth is especially important with peonies. Want to make sure that the uppermost bud, and of course, if it's a potted peony, it's a little hard to tell where the uppermost bud in the roots are, called the eyes. The eyes down in a peony root system, those buds, the uppermost one should not be any deeper than about 1.5 inches, because if they're planted too deeply, you might get leaves but no blossoms. So they're very sensitive to planting that's too deep. So if it's growing in a pot already, make sure that you just barely cover that soil with your ground soil.
Okay.
So to avoid getting it too deeply planted. Otherwise, plant them at about the same depth. Water very well right after planting. Be sensitive that the roots that you've taken out of pot are, you're disturbing them a little bit. And so get water on it as quickly as you can on those. So perennials. Are you going to plant some more perennials, John, this year?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what we will, but we're going to definitely do more. We're bumping out in the front garden, which is kind of more of a cottage garden. We're going to bump that out a little bit more, give us some more space to add up there.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's going to be fun again. And as long as we're talking about perennials, roses kind of are in that similar category too. So roses love organic matter, and they typically don't have such an extensive root system. If ever you've dug up a rose bush that didn't make it, I've had some that have died after 4 or 5 years, but I'm always amazed at they don't develop much of a big fibrous root system. The root systems tend to be kind of a little woody and not all that much. So we can easily amend that soil. Roses love peat moss and other organics. So a good time at planting to incorporate those. Now, we mentioned on peonies, don't get them too deep. Now, roses are the opposite. Roses love to be planted deeply. So if you locate the crown is the spot on a rose bush between the branches and the root system. It's that juncture right there. And the crown of a rose bush should be planted at about 4 to 6 inches below soil surface.
Oh, wow.
There's a good reason for that. You won't see this in books written in other parts of the country. They won't indicate to plant that deeply. But the reason for planting it that deep is that gives some good natural winter protection. And soil is a pretty good insulator. And if you get the rose bush down in the soil like that, it's less apt to freeze out. And so even if we have a severe winter, such as this last year, I had a lot of dieback on the canes, but because they're planted deeply, the material that comes from ground level should be your good material. And, I had to cut back some of my roses this year down to about an inch or so. But because they were planted so deeply, that crown, the kind of the life point of that rose bush was down below ground level enough so that they're coming back nicely now.
Good. I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, I am too. So I'm happy because even the winter hardy Canadian roses in a winter with no snow insulation like this one, they can have their dieback.
So let's take a quick little break. When we come back, let's talk about more about planting certain types of things, including shrubs.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, we're back, and this week we're talking about how to plant our plants. We talked about our annuals, our perennials. We talked about vegetables. Let's talk about shrubs.
Yeah, well, I need to plant a new potentilla shrub because I had planted one later last summer and the rabbits totally ate it. If they just nibbled it down, that would be fine. But that young little potentilla wasn't that large, and they chewed it down to about all that was left was the roots. And so I got to plant a new potentilla for one thing. So when planting shrubs, when you take them out of the pot, take a look at the root system. If there's a lot of circling roots all around in those pots, then gently tease them apart or take a sharp knife and cut down through in about 4 sections and across the bottom. We want to avoid circling roots. For example, if you just took a shrub out of its pot, and all those roots are circling all around, and then plant that down in, those roots will generally stay in that circle without going outward naturally. And that's one advantage. Some garden centers sell bare root shrubs, and so bare root means they're not in a container. So when you get them home, you can just plant them and naturally radiate out those roots. Bare root, nurseries can't keep them on hand the way they can container. They have to be kept kind of in cool refrigerations. That's why you don't see every garden center offering bare root because they just don't have the shelf life as a container one. So plant shrubs just slightly deeper maybe than they are in the pot so that your soil covers the soil that was in the pot. If the pot soil is exposed to air, moisture tends to wick up out of that. So it's good with shrubs to have some of your own ground soil covering over that. And it's nice maybe to locate it in a little bit of a depression so that when you water, the water doesn't just all run off, but you can have a little circle of water around that shrub. And so shrubs are pretty straightforward for planting. The main thing is to tease away or cut away circling roots so that they can go outward.
And what about for shrubs? Like, we were talking about things like with roses, or do we want to put organic matter in the bottom of the hole in a shrub?
Yeah, on shrubs have root system that will go outward farther than roses or perennials. And so with shrubs, you can amend the soil, but pretty soon those roots are going to go out beyond your amended soil. Some shrubs, I'm glad you mentioned it, John, because some shrubs really do like an amended soil, especially hydrangeas.
Okay.
Hydrangeas love an organic peaty type soil. And so, yeah, absolutely amend the soil of those. If it's a dogwood, some of those that are just rock solid and will just grow in almost anything, I probably wouldn't probably amend those. But I'm glad you brought it up because hydrangeas are so popular. And yes, amend with plenty of organics for that.
How about trees? Shrubs lead us right into trees.
Oh, and of course, trees. Planting is ever so important because that tree is going to be with us for maybe 100 years or so or more, depending on type. So getting the planting right is very important. Okay, and here's why. We're finding that if trees aren't planted in a certain way, in about 15 to 20 years, those trees can die because of the way they were planted. So we'll get into that in just a couple of seconds. And so what can happen is if you don't follow the right planting procedure, in 15 or 20 years, the tree might break off its soil line, or it might have big roots that are circling around the trunk like a boa constrictor to kind of constrict water and nutrients going up and down. So let's talk about the planting of trees. So when you dig the hole, should you amend the soil on trees? Should you put in peat moss and organics into the planting hole and the backfill soil? The answer is no, because the research has shown that if you make the hole nice and the soil is wonderful, beautiful, the tree roots will not want to leave that and go out into your native soil because the soil that you've prepared is so wonderful. And trees very soon have to have their roots go out because tree roots extend out beyond the trunk from to a distance at least as far as the tree is tall. So if you've got a tree that's 30 feet tall, the roots are going to be out 30 feet. Some types, they'll go twice that far. And so we cannot amend the soil that far out. And so it is better just to backfill the tree, the planting hole, backfill it with your normal soil. If it's heavy clay, well, so be it.
What you dug out of
there. Yeah, whatever you dug out of there, backfill it with that. Because those tree roots have to get immediately used to that soil and be ready to go outward. We can't make it so lovely that they don't want to leave home. And so don't amend the soil. Now, planting depth is very important, like I mentioned. So to gauge the proper planting depth on a tree, look at the spot where the trunk meets the roots. There's a point there called the trunk flare. So if you think of an old established tree growing on a lawn, where the tree meets the ground, it usually flares outward. It becomes wider as it enters the ground, called the trunk flare. And that point, even on a young tree, that point has to be above soil line when you're done. If you plant the tree too deeply, for example, you can tell if a tree's been planted too deeply if it goes into the ground as straight as a telephone pole with no flare. If that tree is planted too deeply so that trunk flare is buried down below soil surface, it'll probably grow for a while, maybe 10 years, maybe 15. And then it'll start having problems, trunk rot and different things. We've done post-mortems on trees that have died after 15 years or so. Oftentimes we'll dig down and discover that it was planted maybe 4 or 5 inches too deep, and the tree just eventually goes downhill. So that flare needs to be above ground level, and a person can even, if you wonder on your planting depth and you did a little digging right around the base of the tree, the uppermost root, the big root that comes off the trunk, should be just below soil surface. So the proper planting depth has one, so you can see the flare as it's going into the ground, and also the uppermost root, which you can see on a potted tree usually, is just right below soil surface. And then the next thing is when you take that tree out of the pot, in most cases, there are going to be roots circling around because they've got pretty good root systems. And when they're in a pot, the roots got nowhere to go other than growing in a circle. And so old recommendations used to be to don't disturb the root system because you, disturb the root system.
Right.
And and then about 20 years later, we found that the roots never left that circle. And some of the uppermost roots, as those big roots enlarge and the trunk enlarges, the big roots can contact the trunk and be girdling the trunk almost like a boa constrictor. I saw a yard just last week in which they actually had some grass problems, but I noticed from the photograph that their tree, at the base of the tree, had this big root that was circling in contact with the trunk itself, and it had started to embed itself in the trunk. So those are called stem girdling roots. The root enlarges, the trunk enlarges, they meet. Pretty soon the root, as that grows, the trunk is trying to grow out beyond that big circling root, and you have a boa constrictor cutting off the life support. And so if that continues, those trees will die. They'll snap off at ground level as the tree gets constricted enough. So we can keep our tree growing for many, many years if we're sure that we plant it properly. Otherwise, it might take 15, 20 years, but those trees, if they aren't properly planted, can have a very short lifespan. And so it's so very, very important. Immediately after planting that tree, to eliminate the circling roots, I don't know if we got into that quite as much as we should have. So tease the roots apart or cut them, maybe make at least 4 cuts around that, plus teasing the roots apart. Cut some of the roots on the bottom. And do that quickly. We mentioned that roots don't like air, so do the operation quickly. Have the tree, have the hole already dug so that as soon as you monkey around with the root system, plant it, backfill it, and immediately water. Now, how much water should a newly planted tree take? It's probably going to, depending on the tree size and the size of the hole, but at least a couple of 5-gallon buckets of water. Slowly pour enough, that's going to squish out any air spaces. Roots can't bridge dead air, so we need to get the soil in contact with the roots. And then how often should we be planting a newly planted tree? Not every day.
Watering.
Watering.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say planting?
Yeah, that's right.
So how often should we be watering a newly planted tree? Not every day. Maybe it's twice a week. It'll depend on the weather. Maybe it's only once a week, but just scratch down with your fingers. If there's moisture there, dark, moist soil, then don't water. The tree has enough moisture. But if it's starting to dry, then apply again, 5 to 10 gallons of water instead of, just dribbling a small amount on to keep it continually soaked. But just let it dry out. And, we can kill trees by keeping them too wet.
Yeah.
And a similar thing, too, if we kind of go into the shrubs, perennials, things like that, monitor the soil, scratch down a little bit with your fingers. Don't let them wilt, but certainly don't overwater them as well by keeping them continually moist.
Let's talk a little bit about where to plant things, because talking about things where you don't want the moisture to dwell. You want to probably, unless it's a plant or shrub that wants to be in a wet area, you want to keep things out of kind of low-lying areas. If you've got a spot in your yard that dips down and you want to fill it with something, maybe it's towards the back end or something like that, really do some research and find something.
that is a good point. Here's a good example, John, of what you bring up. Sometimes at the back of a lot line, it slopes a little bit, water drains down there, so it drains away from the house. We planted lilacs. And it didn't occur to me at the time, but we planted a row of lilacs there. Within 3 years, they were dead. Lilacs do not tolerate soil that stays a little moist. Doesn't even have to be active standing water. Lilacs do not like it moist soil. And so they died. So I thought, yes, I knew that, but I just didn't comprehend it at the time. So anyway, we ended up replanting lilacs on higher ground. So along that area that had moisture, we planted dogwoods because dogwoods love moist soil. So yeah, definitely eye up the location. And if it's somewhere that has moist soil, such as a drainage area, then plant a tree or shrub that likes moisture. Willows, poplars, all like moisture for trees. Shrubs that like moisture, the dogwoods that I mentioned beautifully. So especially lilacs are one. If you were to point to a shrub that does not like a certain situation, lilacs are wonderful, easy to grow, but they got to have a soil that drains. So plant those kind of higher up on the slope. Other types of things, if you've got a hot, sunny spot, the potentilla that I mentioned, boy, it loves. They're native out in western North Dakota. Yeah. So, it loves it hot and dry. So very important to do a little research as to the microclimate or the location that a shrub or perennial or tree enjoys so that it'll really thrive. Because it's interesting, on a person's yard, you have all these little microclimates. If you're in a brand new location without much trees, not much established things, it takes a little while to get a microclimate in your yard. But it happens, as the trees grow and you get a little more protection, then you get these wonderful little microclimates of things, an area that gets a little filtered sunlight, or, that you can kind of start tweaking your yard for what best applies. So that's a good point, John.
Yeah, another note along with that is to consider how close to the house to plant something like a tree or a shrub, but knowing that those roots are going to grow.
Boy, you got it. And, if you're, that's a good point. If your foundation is sound, most trees and shrubs are not going to crumble in your foundation. But if there's a crack, roots can find their way in. And so in addition to not wanting things that close physically, because, you don't want them to find a crack in your foundation. But another good case, too, is many of us tend to plant things just too close to the house.
Yeah.
Okay, for example, I planted the Trader mulberry, which is a wonderful winter hardy mulberry. I planted that, and I didn't do my research. It gets 30 feet tall. I planted it where I want something that's 10 feet tall. And so I just pruned it the other night. So I am needing to then prune that yearly to keep it at the height. And so, yes, read the label, myself included.
When we were talking about planting trees, sometimes you see, and it can look really nice, but you see that people will plant flowers under trees. Any advice with that? Or is that something that under a newish tree, will they compete for water? Or are you going to have two different types of watering schedules there where the flower may want to be watered more often than the tree? Well, that
watering is a good point, that the flowers might want to be kept wetter than the tree would want. And so keeping the flowers moist enough might be overwatering the tree. The other thing that, as soon as you started to describe that, I thought too, occasionally people will put a raised planter around the tree trunk in which they can plant some flowers. But raising the soil around a tree trunk, such as an established tree, can cause trunk rot. Okay. And so, it's important not to fill in around established trees because, it essentially gets them at too deep of a planting situation again. And so trunks can rot by putting too much soil around that. So if a person does want to put flowers around a tree, don't raise the soil up against the tree trunk, and maybe make sure it's something compatible so you aren't having to keep it too moist and too wet.
All right. Lots of good things to think about.
I'm excited to plant.
I know. We're getting, like I said, we're getting there. It's I get out there and digging in the dirt and figuring out where things go, and it'll be fun. This will be a good growing year.
Yes, I've got my peat moss and everything ready, so I'm going to, on my perennials, I'm going to incorporate lots of organic matter on in, and I'm excited. Again, this is a month that a lot happens.
All right, so if people have questions for you, whether it's about planting or how something that they've already planted, how that's doing, or any kind of advice that they want to get, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email. Photos are always great. Donald.Kinsler, spelled Kinzler, donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu. And thanks for everyone that listens, and thanks for those who have written in.
All right, Don, we'll talk to you next week.
Great. Thank you, John.